Hello everyone, and welcome to Miss Hinojosa's class, Behind the Scenes. Okay, today we're going to be doing sort of a science adjacent type of art experiment thing. I have this lesson that I like to teach my middle school students where they learn about different sort of things you can do with watercolor and get the basics for painting with watercolor. It's not a lesson that I made up. I'll see about linking this lesson if you're interested. And we use these basic and wacky watercolor techniques. I'll try and link that too. But basically, every year when I teach this, I'm teaching them these cool things like... Okay, sorry about that. Got a phone call. Does your dog know your spouse's ringtone? Because mine does. And he knows that it means they're coming home. Crazy dog. So basically each year I teach these fun things like Crayon Resist and throwing salt on watercolor to give it texture. But every year I wonder, what if I did this a little bit differently? Am I giving the best instruction for this to turn out as well as it should? So this video is basically me testing it out. I usually do it in two parts, so we'll probably do one part today and one part in a sequel. Okay, the first thing I'm gonna do is a basic wash, just flat area of color. And this step is really important for my students because they probably haven't painted before or haven't painted with watercolor. And so, there's some key instruction that I've learned to give them. And this is the same size paper that I use with them. And these are the paints that I use with them. It's important, since I'm doing these as experiments, to help me teach them better that I use their materials. Let's just start with orange. I tell them to get a paintbrush off of their desk and I provide watercolor ones. And then we just start getting the palette wet and painting. I have noticed over the years that it's important to tell them to paint all the way off the edges of the paper because otherwise they just paint in the middle. And so I just tell them, paint quickly, try to paint evenly. So the experiment here is it better to paint vertically going across? Will it come out more even? Right? So some students will want to paint horizontally and some will want to paint vertically, or maybe switch it up. But I try and tell them, make sure you're covering up the whole thing and work from one edge to the other. And during this time, I'm really telling them instructions like make sure you're dipping your paintbrush in the water, then revisit the paint palette, then spread it out. If it's too dark, go back for more water and smooth it out. If it's too light, go back for more paint. Basic beginner instructions. Some of them will come out really blotchy, some of them will come out more smooth. It just depends on the kids' experience and their natural talent. I don't think there is a lot to experiment or learn here, but we did get started. Okay, it has been a day, which is the minimum amount of time my students will wait to see their finished work. So let's just review this. Looking at these plain washes, this is the one where I did my brush strokes vertically across the short end of the paper, and this is the one where I went horizontally. Not really a lot of difference, doesn't matter that much. I do feel like I have more control of the amount of color in an area when I go this way. So for students who are struggling to get their paint to do what they want, I probably will recommend this. But when I'm teaching this, I am teaching it as a learn from experience. And so while I may tell my students, look, I brush this way across the short side of my paper because it's easier for me to control my color and my paint, I'm not telling them that's what they have to do. I'm just telling them we need to go quickly because you need to get your whole paper covered and you want it to be pretty even in color. But that some variation, some light to dark variation is normal and expected and one of the beauties of watercolor as well. So conclusion, I don't need to change how I teach this, and that's what I expected. I always have my students working on top of some newspaper, so should have known to start there. Okay, now we're gonna look at dry brush, which is more interesting. I have some more questions there that I need to work on. So we start off, and I tell them to moisten the color they're gonna use. Let's use red. So just kind of like put some water in there and get it started. But then to dry off their paintbrush, really dry, and go back and just touch the ends of the bristles into the paint, and then start making brush marks. Now, they come out pretty solid at first, but they should get streakier as you go, and you can see here, like I need to get some more color. It's hard to do dry brush. Some kids it'll come out really well, but those kids, they also won't come out well. They work so dry that the last one, the wash, will have come out blotchy, but this will come out really well for them. I guess it's just experience. So I've done this to where I don't tell the kids which direction to brush. I've done this where I tell them, you know, paint vertically. Let's try some sideways here. There, now we're getting some really good dry marks. But I also have to make sure to tell them to paint all the way off the edge of the page. Otherwise they'll just have some like stripes, and tell them to overlap. Okay, so that is how I normally teach it. Now I want to know if I start off with a wet brush and then just barely like scratch the surface of my color, if I get better dry brush marks. I don't know. I don't know that it really makes a difference. I'm not very good at doing dry brush. And I tell my students that. I say, dry brush isn't my favorite, or it's not what I'm best at. That doesn't mean that they can't be good at it. Okay, now I'm getting some good marks because I'm doing bad practice, kind of stabbing the paint. Okay, but it's getting to the point where I can't get any more paint. Maybe this is what I want. It's not as dark as I want. So more water. Now it's gonna come out smooth again. Okay, so this is dry paint, wet brush, wet paint. And they don't look all that different. This one feels like the color, this one was a more enjoyable experience. Like, it felt easier. This felt like it took more work. And, you know, dry brush, it's right in the name. So, my conclusion, I'm teaching it the smart way. Okay, this next one is going to be Crayon Resist. So pretty simple. The wax in the crayon as a resist pushes the water and therefore the color away from areas on the paper. I let my students pick out whatever color they want, but I tell them to be thoughtful about what color they use and coordinate it with what color they're going to paint. So they could do like an opposite color, like red and green, or they could do similar or family colors, like blue and purple, but that the effect isn't going to be as bright if they do family or neighbor colors. Unfortunately, all I have here are multicultural crayons. You know, great crayons, but not exactly fun colors. I kind of know the answer to this already, but you can see it in action. Basically, I tell my students that they have to draw really hard, and they can even use white because it'll show up. Okay, so basically, I'm gonna write light on this side and heavy on this side. And I tell my students they can draw whatever they like, but that like shapes and patterns and just lines are gonna be the best thing to do here. I've told them to write secret messages in the past, but that didn't work out well for the end product. So basically, if you write light, there's not enough wax to resist. And I tell them just to paint this like you would a wash. And as we're going, if I notice some students' work isn't showing up, I make sure to tell them it's okay because we're experimenting. Maybe they didn't write hard enough. Maybe they have too much pigment and not enough water in their paint. Okay, so you can see that worked really well as a resist. Now let's do the light writing side. And as you can see, the lightly drawn side just doesn't have the same impact as the heavy writing side. So it's important to make sure to tell your students to draw very heavy in order to get wax resist or crayon resist to work. Here's a different experiment on the same lines. What about colored pencil? I think that colored pencil is going to come out more like writing lightly with crayon, but, you know, we're here to experiment. Let's start with some line. What if I like scribble in a whole area? This one I'm more light coloring, like the way I would show my students to color. Okay, and so that watching this isn't completely boring. Oh, that's a brown. Oops, that's dark. Okay, and for consistency, I'll just do green again. Okay, so I've got some slight resist here from the white. You can kind of see the paint, well, I can see, I don't know if you can see. The paint is kind of beating up around the edge of the color, or the paint of the paint is kind of beating up around the edge of where those white lines are, but it's definitely not resisting as well as crayon. And once you just paint over it a little bit more, it kind of gives up. But hey, it's kind of what we expected from a light drawing. Anyway, let's try the heavy side. Oops. Okay, there's some resist there, but I think that's more like a dent in the paper. Yeah, then I can go over it. Yeah, it's even blending with the yellow here and making it like yellow-green. So yeah, there's not really any resist happening with color pencil. So if you were wondering about that, now you know. I mean, there is some like color difference, but it's not a resist. Okay, next, let's try this wet in wet. Now, some of my students do snicker when I say that. It just doesn't sound quite right, but if you just ignore that and move right on by, nobody will stick to it. Basic principle here is that you need to paint your whole paper with just water. My water's pretty dirty. That's better. At this point, before doing this one, I'll let my students get new water if their water's already dirty. If you're in a situation where you can't have a bunch of kids at the sink at once and you just don't have time for that, then I would suggest doing this either as your second method right after the basic wash, or doing this as the first one on the second day. That way they all have clean water and you didn't have to get a new cup. All right, principle here is that you get the whole paper wet, and I tell the kids to paint fast because their paper needs to be wet when they start adding paint. Now the trouble here is that this side of my paper is already a little bit dry. Now I'm gonna go back and re-wet it. So for this version, I'm gonna say that you want the paper to be like a puddle. That you want water built up on the surface. You want there to be water sort of flowing on the surface. This is why I have my students do this one last and get new water, is because it's so messy. So I tell them to pick 2 neighbor colors because they will turn out the best. So let's do blue and green. If they don't want to do neighbor colors, that's fine. They just need to know what the consequences are. Look at that. Really having that puddle on there lets the color just flow. Just one color looks cool. You can see like the edges of colors pushing away the other edges. Then I'm gonna add in my second color here. And look how differently it behaves. You know, is that because paper's already drying a bit? I think it's just because the colors behave differently, or because this is already very liquefied, whereas the blue is not. And I tell my student that you really just want to barely touch the tip of the brush to the paper. We're not actually painting here. We're just letting the paint leak off the brush onto the paper. Let's try some more blue. And I tell them they can go back and add more color if it starts to look faded out. But of course, you know, you're in class, you have to set a timeline. You have to finish in a reasonable amount of time so that you can move on or clean up. So I'm gonna be done with that one. Very carefully move this whole thing. Okay, so watching what I was doing, I have a theory that maybe having my paint already really wet may help it be more vibrant. So I'm just adding some more water, and we're gonna do the same thing, but this time we're gonna see if we can get the blue to activate more. Maybe I'll start with the green and see if it spreads out like the blue did, but it just really doesn't. Oh, wait, there we go. Okay, add the blue. I should have written on these what they were. I like how the blue does like a double burst, dark and then a light. It doesn't stay. It spreads out and just becomes like sky. So far, not seeing a big difference, all right, between switching the colors or even having the color pre-wet. So let's go on to my final experiment. And you know what? This may not be my final one. My thought is maybe you don't actually want a puddle of water on the surface. Maybe you just want the whole paper to be a little bit wet, so maybe it's okay if it's partially like started to dry. And I just tell my students like to look at their paper at a different angle to see if it's glossy, and that if it's glossy then it's wet. So it's all just a little bit wet, not really got a lot of puddles, just sort of wet. So let's do this again. Start with blue on that side and start with green on this side. The green just does not spread as fast as the blue. And I guess that's just the nature of that color, pigments in the binder. Okay, still not seeing a big difference. I think the blue may have been a little bit more contained, may not have bled out quite as quickly. I want to try one more thing. Ooh, it's not very wet on this side, but it is not very completely wet on this side either. Interesting. Okay, there we go. Now it's all wet. Okay. You know, if this doesn't make that big of a difference, I may teach my kids to just dip their paper in the water. I won't really know how these came out until they're completely dry, so we'll come back and check on them. Okay. This one's a little more difficult. I don't remember what I did for each of these, but I do know this is my first, second, third, and fourth attempt. I believe on this one I just did it regular. I just painted it and dripped the watercolor on it. You can see there's some interesting whooshes here from when I picked up the paper and the water ran. That can make some interesting effects, but it can also feel like it ruins effects that you had that you already liked. The thing about this method that I don't like is that the watercolor feels like it just blurs to nothingness. Some of my students will have great success where their color that they dropped has more crisp edges, and I got closer to that with this last one that I just dipped in the water. I do remember that. So I'm thinking that instead of adding more water, the solution is actually to add less water. And I do remember playing around with adding the green versus adding the blue first. When I was painting, remember the green was holding its shape. The color wasn't running as much, but now you can't really tell that that was the case. This is one of those ones that can look completely different the next day, and so it's imperative that my students write their name on their work or they just won't recognize it. So I think my conclusion here would be paint your paper with water, but don't oversaturate it, because I think that brings out the most interesting, crisper shapes. Let's do our last one for today, which is blot. Use a paper towel to blot up wet paint to reveal white paper underneath. This is actually pretty cool. You can use it to make like clouds in the sky, or like clean up when your black paint straight into your yellow paint. It's not a perfect fix, but it's a good technique to have under your belt. First thing you want to do is paint your whole paper with the wash. I do tell my students to pick a color other than yellow because yellow is very light and it just doesn't show the difference as dramatically. I'm going to do red. It's not as dark as purple or blue, but it will still show so long as I paint it on there dark enough. So the question here is when to blot, because if you blot when it's very wet, are you going to be able to get the most color up? Will the color bleed back into where you blotted? So if I want my students to blot pretty early on, I'm going to tell them to do it like as we go. I don't have them paint the whole paper first because I don't want to build in failure. I don't want to add problems. That's fairly wet, so I need a dry paper towel. Okay, and we just use the school paper towels. Okay, so that picked up a good amount. I tell them just, make it messy, that it's gonna be more interesting that way. And I may have just Missed my window since I had to run off and get a towel. Let's try that again. So, I'm just gonna wad up my towel here and voila. Okay, and that's gonna be it for that one. Didn't really feel like it did much. And I'm gonna let this one dry a little bit and re-wet it. Really just also running out of red paint. And you know, this may also be affected by the type of water I have. I mean, not water. Paper I have. This is not watercolor paper, but this is what I'm using with my students. So I think it's important when you're having your students use supplies that you like test out those supplies with them and know what they're capable of. Otherwise, you know, if you use watercolor paper at home, you might be expecting great things and it's just outside of their reach because of the materials. So I've let it dry a little bit. Let's see. Just kind of like, it's cool. It just took up most of it really. I've got a couple dark spots. Looking at it right now, I really don't see a difference between them, and I don't know how much I did differently. And I'm out of red paint, which was making it difficult as well. I think I'm gonna give this another try in a different color. Okay, we're gonna try one more thing. In my classroom, we don't have nice paper towels. We have the school brown paper towels, you know, that aren't as absorbent. So yep, that looks a lot cooler. Okay, last one, and this one does not look as different the next day or after it's dry. So it looks almost the same when it's dry as when it's immediately done and still a little bit wet. Interestingly here, this one I use the regular good paper towel. If you look closely, you can see the texture of the paper towel, like the little quilted sort of texture. I don't feel like using the paper towel does anything for the watercolor. I don't think it adds any more interesting texture than watercolor just naturally has, so I don't feel like there's a big difference here. On this one, I felt like I was struggling to get enough paint on the paper quickly, so on this one I did it again. Still not really seeing like how the paper towel affected it. This one, I let it dry a little bit more, added water, and then tried to blot it out, but what you really see is just the edges of where the water pushed the color away. And I know on some of these I just blotted it, some of them I held the paper towel on. It's just nothing happening here. This one though, this one is really cool. It's got a nice crisp texture that's created, and this was using the newspaper to dab it instead of the paper towel. Now the paper towel works great if you're just trying to remove color or remove a mistake, but I like the way that the less absorbent material pushed the color out of the way and left these marks. And I think the school paper towels that we use, there's those brown paper towels that aren't that absorbent. I think they make a better texture, sort of halfway between the good paper towel and the newspaper. This test is inconclusive because I did not use the materials exactly that I have at school. Just use something less absorbent if you want a more striking texture. That is it for today. Thank you for sticking till the end of the video. Make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe. I think that should be right here. YouTube thinks you'll like this video, and if you want to see more of my Miss Hinojosa class, here is that playlist. Why can't I say that?